So thank you, Dambisa, for being here. Dawn Nakagawa, who's worked with me at the Institute for years, is very interested in the subject and will torture Dambisa. And therefore, I think it'll be a good discussion. So thank you. Thank you for being here.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. This is exciting. I haven't had an opportunity to do this for the Berggruen Institute for a while. So we're here with Dr. Dambisa Moyo, and it's a real privilege to be with her. She's a provocative thinker. She has some, I think, very good ideas and solutions in her book, Edge of Chaos, Why Democracy is Failing, and more importantly, what we can do to fix it. As Nicholas said, I'm Dawn Nakagawa. I've been with the Institute since it was barely an idea. Feels like forever. I can't remember life before the Institute. We use these salons as an opportunity to engage our constituency in Los Angeles and share with that constituency ideas that we find important and people that we find amazing. So tonight we have the opportunity to talk to Dambisa, who I consider a friend too. She, as Nicholas has pointed out, he's done a lot of her introduction, but I would point out that Dambisa she's a public intellectual, she's a world-renowned economist, she's written multiple New York Times best-selling books, including Dead Aid, which, again, Nicholas pointed out, was a very controversial book. It really, I think, it prompted a really important discussion around how $2 trillion of aid had failed to solve the problems that it intended to, and forced, I think, everybody in that community to do a lot of soul searching in a way that created and spurred innovation in the space. She's written other books such as Winner Take All, which was about the fight for scarce resources and why China is winning. And everybody who knows our work knows how important China is to our work. So as such, she's a member of the 21st Century Council, which is a council of global leaders who take very seriously geopolitics and the rise of China and how to ensure a sort of peaceful progress towards a superpower transition, which doesn't always end well. But most importantly, in addition to all of the things I've said about her, and she's got multiple degrees in Harvard and Oxford, and if all of that doesn't make you feel like more of an underachiever, in her spare time she runs marathons. So don't let the heels fool you, okay? So thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to start by the Edge of Chaos. It is about, I think everybody realizes that democracy is in crisis, and it's in crisis both because of a changing global order and the challenges we face, as well as some things that are intrinsic to the democratic system itself and makes it ill-equipped for the challenges it's facing. And from what we've seen in our democracy, I think it brings up true questions about whether democracy is adaptable. Can it learn? Can it adapt? So you very boldly take on the challenge of trying to figure out both positing what the challenges are, but ways in which that democracy can and should adapt to address them. So to begin with, what prompted you to write this book right now? What in you made this an important step?
Well, first of all, thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. It's such a glorious day. The notion of sitting indoors and not having alcohol in front of you is quite depressing for me. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank Nicholas, Craig, Dawn, Pam, everyone who's shown up this evening. It's a great pleasure to be able to have a conversation on this very important discussion. I was born and raised in Zambia in southern Africa, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. And throughout my life, my formative years there, we were always told that the path to economic success was through liberal democracy and market capitalism. Over the last 10 years, I've traveled to over 80 countries around the world, rich and poor, democratic and non-democratic. And it's become very clear that people are no longer convinced that democracy is the path to economic success and prosperity. And so the question I've been wondering over the last several years is, why are people like me who believe in liberal democracy and believe in market capitalism failing to convince people? And my conclusion is that we're just no longer convincing. And so that really got me essentially rummaging through the sort of burrowing through the rabbit hole to try and figure out why that was the case, what had happened. But also, more fundamentally, the book is really born out of frustration. My PhD is in economics. I'm very interested in long-term economic challenges from income inequality, concerns about demographics, the burden of debt, productivity declines, technology and the risk of a jobless underclass, et cetera. And yet, all the public policymakers in a liberal democratic system are very short-term in their thinking. And so there's a very natural schism between long-term economic challenges and short-term public policy focus. And so the question is around that myopia, how do we bridge that gap, but at the same time, really, try and solve the questions around legitimacy that I think pervade the democratic process. So if I had to summarize it, I think there are two things I'm trying to tackle in this book. Questions of legitimacy, how do we feel more confident about the outcomes in the political process? It's not about having different outcomes to Brexit or President Trump. We may have landed with the same outcomes, but I think there'd be a sense of legitimacy around that. But it's also the second issue is around myopia and trying to bridge that gap that I mentioned a moment ago.
Near-term thinking, short-termism. So in the book, you talk a lot about the impact of globalization and how globalization, you take an interesting perspective on this by arguing that actually it's not the backlash against globalization, it's the backlash against a half-baked globalization, a globalization that was never really let out full throttle, right? So we've got subsidized industries, you've got trade barriers, you've got restrictions on capital, there's all kinds of ways that we've constrained globalization. So help us understand why more globalization is better and why, I guess, some of the backlash we're seeing might have been prevented or different if we'd had a fuller globalization.
Yeah, so I do worry a lot because from a canonical models of economics, basic economics, globalization should deliver benefits for all and in a very sustained way. However, the reality is we don't have anywhere near the sort of liberal trading model that is suggested in the textbooks. And there are a whole host of reasons for that. There's political imperatives, as you know, in this country, there are farm subsidies to protect the farmers here. In Europe, they have multi-billion dollars of subsidies to protect farmers in Europe through the Common Agriculture Policy. Those policies are very rational in that context in terms of political expedience, but obviously they're very far off from the idea of what globalization is supposed to do, which is essentially people are supposed to focus on doing what they do best. And so that's created a lot of problems. It's created a lot of losers around the world, not just in the middle of America, but across Africa, South America, and Asia. Hundreds of millions of farmers are out of work and struggling to eke out a living because the farming markets in the United States and in Europe are protected. But there's a bigger question around what has happened to the benefits of globalization. And I think this picks up on this theme again of the short-termism in politics. The United States definitely benefited from globalization. It earned billions of dollars, possibly even up to $1 trillion worth of value through the globalization process, through trade, through capital allocation and returns from abroad. But the question is, what did they do with that money? And Jack Ma from Alibaba has been very strident on this point, saying, well, even though America benefited, they didn't invest in infrastructure, which is rated a D+ according to the American Civil Engineers Society. They didn't invest in education in the United States. Instead, public policymakers chose to fight wars. They went to Iraq, went to Afghanistan. And as a consequence, there's some long-term structural problems that have continued to pervade the US economy and more generally countries around the world. So I think that is really the challenge to globalization. The narrative is extremely negative, as we know, is a big pivot now towards more protectionism, real concerns around the fate of the international order. And I think it's born out of this really lack of nuance in understanding what's actually happened.
So you talked a moment ago about how, as you go around the world, people are less and less convinced that liberal democracy is the way forward. How much of that is because of globalization, do you think, and how people are feeling the effects, and I guess the way democracy is maybe failed to protect them or prepare them for it? And how much of it is because there's another model out there, which is China, which has been very effective at creating and sustaining growth over a very long period of time, and now countries are starting to think, well, maybe this is a viable alternative, maybe it's a better alternative.
So for sure, I think economic challenges have been catalytic in making people feel more disaffected and disengaged from the political process. But many of the challenges to democracy today are kind of homegrown. Voter participation rates have declined over the last several decades. They were in the high 60s in the 1960s. Today, America's participation rate is around 50%. For low-income households, it's less than 30%, very similar to what you see in places across Europe. But we've also seen that money has seeped into the political process. According to the New York Times, just 158 families in this country are responsible for 50% of the political contributions at the 2016 presidential election. So very far off the one man, one vote type of political environment that's promised in a democracy, and very much more plutocratic, that people who have cash, and not just individuals, but through the lobbying process where money has actually doubled in the past 10 years, all that money seeping in, and with obviously on the back of the Citizens United decision by the US Supreme Court, is just creating this us versus them. There are lots of surveys that underscore this point. According to the Pew survey, a recent Pew survey, over 80% of Americans do not believe or trust the federal government to regularly do what is right. You would have seen the Freedom House surveys around trust, but also the fact that political freedoms have declined over the past 10 years. There's a survey from the World Economic Forum that says that citizens around the world today have more faith in authoritarian governments in terms of delivering economic outcomes than democracies. And that, I think, picks up on your point around this deep concern that the long-term challenges that we are facing are better addressed by public policymakers that aren't constantly dragged into fighting elections. So I think there's a big sense of that has corroded or is eroding the political democratic process. But essentially the book is very focused on solutions, which I'm sure we're going to get to. There are 10 solutions in the book. As I said earlier, designed to address legitimacy, but also critically this myopia. And what is very important to understand, I think, is that each of these proposals has some precedent in the world. So they're not just me pulling them out of a hat. I've kind of surveyed countries around the world. So as crazy and controversial as they may seem to some American audiences, the fact is that they do have we've already had some experience in different countries of these proposals working. And so I think to jumpstart democracy, particularly in the United States, which is to this day the vanguard of the democratic process, I think we do need to seriously take a look at these proposals.
So your solutions are both for voters and for policymakers. There are 10 of them. We're probably not going to get through all 10. You have to buy the book. They're on sale over there. But I wanted to ask you.
Why don't you list them, Dambisa? Sorry.
Oh, gosh.
Why not?
Well, but wait, we're going to. We have to keep some
It's a
secrets.
commercial. It's a
Come
commercial.
on. No, I wanted to ask you, there have been some that people do consider controversial, as you just mentioned. One is mandatory voting.
Yes.
The other is some sort of minimum requirement for people to actually engage in the electoral process. Can you talk a little bit about those two, and why actually in most of the reviews that I've read, people sort of latch on to those as
Well,
concerns?
very tragically, I think that I've been reviewed in the Financial Times and in the Wall Street Journal and many other places. I think it really reveals how bad the education system is, because they don't really understand what I was saying. So that already is quite an indictment. But before I dive in, may I just give a bit more context? So of the 10, 6 of them are targeting politicians, 4 of them are for the voters. Let me just, if I may, maybe pick up on Nicholas's outburst over there. So on the politician side, I'll start with the politicians because they're a little bit less controversial in some respects. One of the things I propose is to have higher pay for politicians, but also force them to justify their compensation. So I picked Singapore as an example. Singapore's prime minister gets paid about $1.7 million a year. But the interesting thing is that the ministers of the different departments get 30 to 40% bonuses depending on economic outcomes. So if you see life expectancy improvements or GDP increasing or inflation staying at bay, those type of metrics, they look at that and they adjust and pay politicians for upside improvements, but they also claw back if they don't perform. So I say, well, that's very much what happens in the private sector, so why shouldn't we be thinking about doing that kind of innovation in the public sector in the United States and elsewhere? Another example of a proposal that I talk about for politicians is minimum standards of politicians. So in Britain in the 1960s, the average age of politicians was around 62, and they had varied experiences: doctors, lawyers, teachers, farmers. They became parliamentarians. Today, some of the surveys that I cite in there, the average age is around 40, and many people are just professional politicians, and I think that's a great disservice to us. And then I'll just give one more on the politician side, which is about extending terms. And so Mexico, right next door, the president has one term and it's for 6 years. In Brazil, the senators have 8 to 9 year senatorial seats. They don't have to fight the election again. I think there's something quite good about the president being in office and not worrying about fighting the next election. In the United States, as we know, the elections are every 2 years. You know, this is massively disruptive, especially since the business cycles are on average 6 years. So, you know, issues of how we might bridge that gap again could be addressed by extending terms, but also capping terms. To the point about the voters, I do talk about mandatory voting. There are 27 countries that have mandatory voting around the world, Australia being one of them, Belgium, Luxembourg, Greece. And essentially, for people who aren't familiar with it, you get fined if you don't vote. And it's not just about monetary fines. You will get blocked or barred from taking advantage or using public services. So you have to show, if you want to get a job in government, you have to show that you voted. There's some more extreme examples I talk about in the book where, you know, access to public health care or education requires evidence that you voted. So it's very antithetical to the American system of First Amendment, my right to choose. But I think if you want to increase the participation rates, in many of these countries, participation rates are over 90%, we might want to think about something that dramatic. And then, of course, you alluded to the more controversial point around weighted voting in the book. Canada and Switzerland are experimenting with this. It's a very simple concept, which is essentially you allocate weights, more or less weights, not based on IQ or race or gender, any of the stuff that people are misunderstanding, nor education per se. It's really about allocating those weights based on engagement. How engaged are you as a citizen? And I'm not, the reason, and perhaps as an immigrant to this country, but also to Britain, I'm not particularly fazed by the idea of tests, because immigrants know that if you want to become a citizen in this country, you have to take a test. So it's not that surprising, and I think it could work. But weighted voting already exists in the Democratic Party in the United States. There's superdelegates who have a bigger weight than average delegates. There are some extreme versions worth thinking about, and I talk about them again. You know, this idea that, you know, I really don't know much about the healthcare sector, but there's a sense that people who work in that sector, doctors and nurses and other medical staff, will have a better understanding of whether the marginal dollar is best spent on beds or x-rays or medicine. I have absolutely no idea, and therefore perhaps their weight should count more. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that would block me out of that. It would just mean that I would have to show that I'm au fait with issues around the medical sphere. You could make the same argument for education, etc. I think the last point I'll just make is that I can see this kind of a system working quite well in referenda. I think it might be very hard to sell it for general elections, but I think there's something quite interesting worth considering. And then I'll just close off by saying there's another version of this which is very popular, which was discussed around the Brexit vote, that perhaps younger people should have a bigger vote for something like Brexit, because their future would be much more determined by the implications of the decision. And, you know, we are older people, perhaps less so. As somebody who's on the older side, I actually could make the argument that actually older people have more knowledge about how the economy works, and so their vote should count more. But nevertheless, the point just being that these are areas of experimentation that are gaining traction in many countries around the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. And I think thank you for being willing to foray into the controversial, to shake people up and make people think about how, to the extent to which we need to really start experimenting with our democracy if we're going to actually make the changes needed to make it resilient in the face of its challenges. In turn, talk a little bit more about mandatory voting. You make a point in the book about why it's important to have a more broad-based, sort of electorate and have a democracy that reflects that. Some would argue that actually some of the things you've been talking about, like weighting or making sure that people with expertise are actually, and informed and engaged people are making these decisions. Why would mandatory voting help and improve our democratic system?
So I think what's most important to bear in mind is what kind of democracy do we think is a successful democracy? And I think there are two things. One is we want as many people as possible voting. So having 50% participation rates is not a good equilibrium. But we also want to have knowledgeable voters. So I find it farcical when we hear somebody was voting because they liked someone's pantsuit or they liked their personality. That is not the quality of democracy that I think is sustainable. But I think maybe to take an extension of your question, what happens if we don't adopt any of the proposals that I'm suggesting here? And I think that there are sort of two extremes that could occur. And these are consequences of people not voting. One is, we already touched on, is plutocracies. So you have fewer and fewer people voting. We've seen this in the rotten borough models of democracy in the past in Britain, where very few people could determine. In fact, in many cases, individuals could decide who would be the member of parliament. Those type of extremes are incredibly dangerous because public policy then reflects the interest of a narrow band or very few people and not the broad-based society. On the other hand, we could have more populism, which is also a very big theme across Europe. Hungary, Poland, for example, are two places which are, I would say, beset. Italy, of course, another place beset by the populist extremes. In those cases, the middle has collapsed and you have these left and right extremes. What essentially happens is the government ceases to function, and the real concern around long-term focus, I think, becomes much more challenged. And so how do we get away from these two extremes? I believe we have to increase the voter participation rates. It may not be through mandatory voting. I think there are lots of tweaks that we can do in the United States that could get us a long way ahead. For example, instead of having an election on Tuesday, we could have it on the weekend when people have a bit more free time. There are issues around subsidizing people who are indigent so that they can participate in the political process. In an era of technology advancements, I think there's a question about whether or not if it can be protected, could that be a path to increase voting participation rates? So there are ways to tackle this, but for now, my great concern is that if we don't do anything, we'll be basically at these two extremes, which I think are both pretty damaging.
So the sort of elite capture that you allude to when we don't have enough people voting, then generally it's the wealthy who are voting and they're going to control the policy making and so on. The situation in the United States is much more dire, as you know. You talk about campaign finance reform. Yes. It seems to me, and I'd love to get your feedback on this, it's probably the most important thing that we can do is to take money out of politics. We don't see the same corruption, I think, and corruption, I use the word loosely, but in other systems. They don't have the same problems because they don't fundraise the way our representatives do and are forced to because the system is so set up. But it also forces a kind of short-termism, right? Because not only the corporations but also the wealthy generally are, it's returns to capital that they're looking for. It's quarterly returns, right? So the short-termism that I think is forced on the entire system by the undue influence of this class it's impossible to overcome unless you eliminate campaign financing.
So I'm a little bit more optimistic. I agree with you. I find the whole, the sort of corruption, as you say, used loosely, of the political system because money has seeped into the process as being incredibly damaging. But I think that if we sit around and wait for some legal decision to happen and to be overturned. I mean, obviously, Citizens United actually just underscored that money in the system was okay. I think if we wait for that day, then I think it'll take much longer to get where we need to be. But I am optimistic because there are, there's a big movement and push, particularly by young people in many different areas where even though things are legal, people find them morally or ethically reprehensible, and there is a sort of groundswell against those types of issues, gun control, issues around the environment and how companies need to respond to that, gender inequity and in general inequity of high-paid workers versus low-paid workers. So those are not illegal per se, but I think that there is a movement to shift the narrative and to shift public consciousness and the zeitgeist around those issues that's beyond the legal frame. So I think that the more young people get engaged and sort of frustrated with the political system, the greater hope there is that we start to see changes about the sort of amount of money that is seeping into the political process. But I doubt it'll be very much to come from a legal standard.
So it's a long way off. So I guess let's talk a little bit about in the book, what do you think are the, I hate to use the word quick wins, I don't think there are any, but what are the things you think are viable ideas in a sort of nearer term versus things that'll take more time?
Yeah, so I think the pay thing is quite compelling to me. Having lived in the United States, I don't mean this in a pejorative way or in a sort of critical way, but the American society is very driven by money and capital. Yeah. And I think the notion of people being rewarded for performance and penalized for lack of performance is something that's deeply ingrained in people's minds. And so I think that's one that people could very easily get behind. Most people in the private sector have already experienced some form of reform of their pension, reform of their bonuses, and they're familiar with that kind of reward for performance kind of program. And so I think it's not such a leap to think that should apply to public policymakers. In fact, the blowback from Speaker Ryan retiring and his pension, I think was pretty indicative that people now feel, that this money thing should be addressed or could be addressed. I think, look, it's realistically harder. It's a harder swallow in terms of mandatory voting, because it is really flying in the face of the First Amendment and the right to choose. But nevertheless, I think that when you think about Australia and other developed countries having adopted that to great effect, I think that it's at least worth consideration. So that's what I would say.
So I'm going to open it up so other people can ask questions, but I just want to ask one more question before I do. The argument in the book is really that there's an imperative for growth that to some extent government is responsible for initiating, for motivating, for prompting. But if that is the case, and an authoritarian system like China is really effective at doing it, why is liberal democracy a better model?
So it's a fantastic question, but I think it goes to the heart of ideological differences between Western thinking, democracy and market capitalism, versus the ideas in a Chinese, quote-unquote, Chinese approach. And the Western system, of course, has a great history in terms of moving people out of poverty, in terms of innovation, and in terms of the viability of democracy, certainly up until the times and the volatility we're seeing now. But it is a very challenged system, because the fundamental idea in liberal democracy and market capitalism is that the most important entity is the individual. And that individual has the right to do whatever they like as long as they're not impinging on the freedoms of somebody else. The problem with that system is that there are a whole host of societal costs that come from that model that we have been very bad, certainly as economists, at calculating and really ascribing to society. So to put it plainly, I can do whatever I like. I can drink, I can eat and become obese, I can have multiple children, and no one's going to stop me. But there are societal consequences to that. If I get diabetes and I have to rely on the public system, well, that's an additional dollar that's going to save me. That's not going to public infrastructure or roads and or education and broader health care. So there are those trade-offs that I think this idea of having this individual held sacrosanct that are challenging. In contrast, the Chinese model, as you call it, is one in which the most important entity is society, it's community. And in that model, the political class recognizes that the individual is not to be trusted. They're like, this crazy human being does bad stuff to themselves.
Right.
We know that if they do bad stuff themselves, what more are they doing for society as a whole? They need to be controlled and checked. We don't like that. That's very antithetical to our views, but it does resonate in some respects because they are able to control the social costs of individual behavior. If I may just give one quick example of a policy that's instituted in China right now, which I think is quite interesting. I know it would never fly in the US, but nevertheless quite an interesting exercise, are these sesame credits. So the political class has decided that we can trade these the value of good behavior. So if I take my 2 nephews and my niece to play soccer on the weekend, well, that's a good thing because they get some exercise, they are not out doing drugs, and they are actually getting healthy. So the political system says, that Dambisa is great. We're going to give her, 2 tickets to see the VIP tickets to see Black Panther, or if she has a relative who's unwell, her relative gets to jump the queue and a line and gets preferential health care. So they're trading off in good behavior. And I think that is something that for that size of a society is quite, it's quite intriguing. But as I said, I just don't think it could ever fly in the United States because people would say, well, it's my privacy. How did you know I was taking my nieces and nephews out to play soccer? But nevertheless, it is fundamentally about this trade-off between individual versus society.
All right, thank you. I'd like to open it up. Would like to ask a question? How about over here?
Thank you so much, Dambisa. Some of the things that you bring up are really, as you say, controversial, but also, as an immigrant, I kind of resonate with a lot of what you're saying. I think that, first, I guess I would say that I think when you are very controversial in this society, right, if we can get a little bit further just by being very, very controversial, that's already progress. So even if we're not, even if we're not going all the way, I think you bring up some really great points. I wanted to ask you what you think about the fact that, how you would say a society like the US, which is very disjointed and so variable in terms of its population, can tackle some of the things that are present in places like Switzerland and Germany, smaller countries that have working very successful democracies. But how can we apply some of the things that you're talking about to such a country such as the US with all of these states and different cultures and points of view, which is really all these different countries in one?
So, first of all, I just want to say that, what is controversial today, potentially controversial today, will be so obvious in years to come. It'll be sort of a joke. People have said to me, this is so shocking. And I said, well, 150 years ago, blacks weren't allowed to vote, women weren't allowed to vote. Somebody who would have definitely been sort of a assigned title as being controversial said, why don't we have women vote? And people must have been like, are you crazy? How would that possibly work? But guess what?
Some people still think it's a bad idea.
Exactly. Well, in Switzerland, they only changed the law in 1971. So, it's not that long ago. But the point being that, I think that this issue around controversy is very contextual and depends how desperate do we think we're going to get. If we have much more populism, is it likely to then become, we're going to be much more desperate to reach out at these changes? To the question of the viability of in the context, how does the context fit? It's a great question. There was a fantastic article over the weekend, actually, in the New York Times, asking, I think the headline question was, is America too big to govern? And it's quite an interesting point because there are many different factions, many different groups. In fact, I did something for the New York Times called By the Book, and one of the questions they asked me is, well, what book do you think encapsulates the American political view. And I said, well, it's just, it hasn't been written. I don't think it could be written because it would have so many different authors, there's so many different perspectives. So I think it is quite challenging. I'm sympathetic to that concern because if you go back to Plato and Socrates, their idea was really about a city-state, not about these national borders at this scale. And I think they will only become more complicated and more complex. One of the things that I was particularly seduced by is something that Michael Bloomberg, who was the 3-time mayor of New York, has talked about, which is that in governing governing New York, he had 50 units reporting to him. Fire. I know we've got the fire sheriff somewhere here.
Pat?
Oh, there he is, right here. But fire, police, sanitation, etc. He realized there's no way I can run these 50 different entities. So the only thing I can do is hire the best person to run the particular department. But he did say, which I think is absolutely brilliant, he said, I'm going to give you the 4 tenets, the guiding principles as you run those businesses. And the 4 things were that there should be no corruption, they need to be forward-leaning, data-driven, and with measured outcomes. It seems very simple, but I think the point is that in a city-state model, it can work quite effectively. The question is, with all these different vested interests and factions, how likely is that to hold? And I think the answer is it becomes very difficult, especially when there's not so much homogeneity. I think that the China context may be a little bit easier because even though it's bigger at scale, there is a lot of homogeneity in the society.
Over here.
So much of what you said is wonderful, and thank you for saying it.
Thank you.
But one of the solutions that you propose is alarming, and I'd like to hear it defended. The notion that some votes should be weighted more than others seems to me to invite a moral purgatory of adjudication by the state over a citizen's democratic enfranchisement. Who decides what that is a bureaucratic nightmare that I'd like to hear you maybe dip into. But let's set aside for the moment that it's in contradiction to your notion of everyone voting. I mean, it could be said that you're proposing 8 solutions because everyone voting, irrespective of their knowledge on policy matters or capability, is canceled out by weighting votes of people who you deem to be extra qualified. To me, this particular solution seems like curing cancer by committing suicide. Right? The core principle of democracy is one person, one vote. And so it seems like a repackaging of epistocracy, Plato's epistocracy, right? The allocation of power and the execution of it by those who know best. Well, I think those who know best have made very, very bad decisions in the past.
So I think it's something that I think I spend a lot of hours thinking about, and especially the articulation of this point, because obviously if it's not obvious to you, I'm a black woman from Africa, I would be the first person stripped of my right to vote if we went on this in a historical context. So I really wanted to make sure that I wasn't being emotional about this, but actually quite objective. And there's just a few points that I just want to reiterate. So one thing is that I didn't state this about these proposals. I know that in some respects, people might say, well, this seems a bit contradictory. And I talk about why they are not contradictory. This is about an evolution of a process. There's been tons of stuff written about countries that are blatantly non-democratic. China is a great example over the last decades. But I wanted to really focus on democracy. What can we do better to make democracies more effective? But in that vein, it's not about people's who are experts per se, because I think that actually lends itself to certain adjectives: landowners, rich, male, women, whatever. We'll take your pick, the different races. But actually, that is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that any immigrant who comes to the United States who wants to be a citizen has to take a civics test already. And so your question about who designs it is absolutely apropos. And I talk about implementation of some of these things. It's not to say that they're not without challenge, but as it stands today, already we have an electoral commission, we have a governmental process that decides how we vote, when we vote, where we vote. So, you know, it's not like we're pulling something new out of a hat. It's about maybe refinement of those processes. And I do talk about having, you know, potentially having some kind of across the aisle, cross-party system as we've had for the Fiscal Commission. And it's not to say that these things are going to be easy to implement, but I do think that there are ways to think more about enhancing the quality of the voter, and with the concerns that you raise at the heart of it.
Isn't this also in conflict with the suggestion that the districting be done on a more egalitarian basis, because then you are then giving certain votes more weight than others?
But again, it depends. It depends on. I mean, you could very well see a situation where people who are traditionally poor areas actually could pass the test, and people who are in traditionally rich areas who are voting today may not. So I think that if we make a lot of assumptions about what gerrymandering means or what the campaign financing boundaries mean, I think that might limit us in terms of the efficacy of these tests. I have not put any testing examples in there, but as I said, you know, very poor immigrants come from all over the world with no education, and if they want a passport, they have to sit a test. It's done today, and it's not sort of theory, and so therefore I think it is possible to actually to come up with something. And you know, the challenge is, what does that look like? And I agree with that is something that requires a lot of input from many different groups. And obviously we don't want it to be IQ based, we don't want it to have certain parameters, but at the same time I think it's too easy for us to say it's a no-go off the top. I think that there's this scope. And the very last point, which I've already made, is that I do see this much more sort of palatable for a referenda than, you know, maybe a general election. And it is already being sort of trialed right now.
Good. Fire chief. Fire chief wins? Okay, Pat, over to you.
First, to your point about Mayor Bloomberg, my colleagues in FDNY and NYPD, absolutely, they tell me firsthand that's how he governed. But he's also unique because he was self-funded, you know.
Yes.
But he did a great job there. My question is, I don't know if it's in your wheelhouse, but there's a lot of discussion on blockchain technology that it's going to eliminate the large institutions, begin to form social bonds because of this so-called immutable record, you know, people with land deeds and stuff like that. Do you see blockchain technology anywhere, or the blockchain in itself somehow being part of the solution to some of these issues?
So and again, I'm going to sound incredibly schizophrenic here, but you know, bear with me. I did write an article, which was, I think it's either in the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, about why I thought technology could potentially be very damaging for democracy. And the argument, on the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, it could make it much easier for many more people to vote, because I then don't have to stand in line. You know, I don't have to sacrifice my minimum wage, you know, because I can't make it to stand in line for 9 hours or whatever. I could just vote from my Palm Pilot, or actually that shows my age, my iPhone. You understand? Okay,
I feel
great.
your pain.
And so in that respect, it's quite appealing. But on the other hand, you know, what is the point of the democratic process? The idea is that we're going to hire or elect these officials to go to Washington and to go and solve these problems. It is not our job, as I see it, to constantly be asked, what do I think about the EU? What do I think about obesity and a sugar tax, et cetera? And I know I'm talking to people who live in California, so you're constantly faced with Proposition X, Proposition Y. But to me, I just think that really is not ultimately about the fundamental best outcome for a democratic process. We want to elect people with as many of us as possible, as knowledgeable as possible, to go and do their job, because there are lots of trade-offs, intergenerational trade-offs that they should be focusing on. So in that respect, I think technology could be potentially quite dangerous, because I think we're getting lazier, and politicians are very keen to pander to today's voters, and so they'll sit there saying, well, what do you think? Should taxes be 15% or 10%? And then we'll be sitting at our desk saying, oh, I think it's 10%. I don't want to live in that world. And so, you know, the boundaries of technology, all other stuff notwithstanding, I think can potentially backfire in terms of the, you know, you end up, I think you could end up, remember I said those two extremes, plutocrats or populism, I think you could end up in a much more populistic society.
Here, we've got lots of questions. Okay, how about over here, and then Kathleen.
In your experience analyzing liberal democracies, what mechanisms do you find that are best at curtailing corruption, and which liberal democracies that you've analyzed have the least amount of corruption?
So one of the things that I think is, two things that are in Britain that I think are quite interesting. They do have a media system which is still somewhat protected. The BBC, everybody has to pay. It's a bit of an annoyance, but it ostensibly is providing true information. It is not about opinion. So I think that there you go. Yeah. So that I think is quite appealing. The other thing is that all political parties at a certain threshold get free advertising, campaign advertising, but it's capped. So everyone gets to do whatever they like. You can use your amount of media time however you wish, but after that, you can't just go and have $10 billion or whatever the number is and run as many campaign ads as you want. And I think there's, again, something quite appealing about that. So those are two examples, both from Britain.
Okay, one over here.
So I think my question perhaps picks up on in the same vein as the preceding questions, and I do apologize for kind of, I guess, my naivety on the subject. But I think a lot of what you've talked about, right, the proposed solutions aims at kind of maximizing the signal to noise of the democratic cycle. For example, the mandatory election is just an example of that. At the same time, right, does that not contradict some of the other proposals? For example, extension of the term, right? If you are aiming to, on the one hand, maximize that signal, but then collect it fewer times, right? Do those things not work against one another in the democratic process?
So I have a number of pages there talking about this contradiction point, because I figured as I was writing it, I was like, hang on a second, does weighted voting contradict mandatory voting? And I think you mentioned that a moment ago. And the thing is, the way I've gotten my head around it is that this is not this is a dynamic process. So what I would hate, and even with the testing idea, I don't think it should be one test and you're done. I think it's kind of like a driver's license in some countries where they say, okay, well, that was valid for 6 years, you need to retest. That just shows people are au fait with the prevailing issues of a particular time. So none of this is static. And so my view is that at some point there should be no need to have weighted voting, because every voter will be knowledgeable at a certain point. As I said, that's the ultimate goal. We want to have participation and knowledge, but for now, there are real questions around how do we move to that equilibrium. So the transitions are always hard. It's kind of like technology and the jobless underclass. It may be fine in 2030 for us to be working 15-hour work weeks, as Keynes predicted, but how do we get there is where it becomes very challenging. And so as I think about the democratic process where we are today, I think we could end up in a great place sometime in the future, but the process of getting there might require some people to be voting today based on civics tests or more engagement. But ultimately, it should be moving us to a better place. So a very simple example of this is, frankly, as somebody who grew up in Africa, civics was mandatory on the junior high school curriculum. I found it baffling that it's not here. Nobody knows, people don't even, adults in this country don't know the difference between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Right. What are you voting for? How do you not even know how government is structured? It's very hard for me to understand. So something like building in the civics system into the educational process, I think is a longer term solution, but in the interim, what do we do to move the discussion? So that's how I square that circle.
Kathleen, you have a question?
Hi. So my question is also building on the first young man's question, which I know we tackled in our first edit of your piece, which is going to be published in the op-ed in the World Post soon. But I was wondering if you could discuss weighted voting in, as displayed in a specific example. So, because weighted voting can easily be interpreted as special interests deciding, what should happen, whether it's teachers or financiers. So, of course, teachers understand education better than the rest of us. Financiers understand, big banks understand finance better than the rest of us, but we don't want to leave it up to them alone to decide, because I'm not a teacher, but if I'm a parent, I have an opinion too. So, okay, so teachers get maybe the first weight vote, parents get the second weight, but then what about the people that aren't teachers or parents, but they live in a low-income community where education's broken, and so they suffer the consequences of crime or, just all of the tangential consequences of a broken education. So that's the beauty of democracy, is that you have the whole society, not what's good for big banks or what's good for teachers, but what's good for everyone. And that's where the nightmare bureaucracy of deciding, okay, you get 1 point, you get 1/5 of a point, you get 5 points. How do you do that?
But that's exactly why.
One example.
But that's that's the immigrant civics tests. When I sat for those tests, I'm not sitting next to only people who went to Harvard. I'm sitting next to people who have lived to come across the border. They don't really understand certain aspects of how the economy works, but that's immaterial. The test is basic enough to show engagement. Everybody's had to study for it, but it shows some engagement and some interest in the area. Just because, in many ways, and this is where there's a bit of confusion. I gave the example of healthcare. We've just given the example of education. That doesn't preclude other people who are not teachers or lawyers or whatever from participating in the vote. You're very welcome to participate, and you could get an equal weight as a teacher, but you would have to show some knowledge and some basic understanding of what's on the ballot. These tests are not designed to be discriminatory in very much the same way that the immigration test is not supposed to be. Well, it maybe is, but it's not supposed to be discriminatory. It's supposed to show that people, or give people opportunity to show that they're engaged and that they understand the system. So I hope that it doesn't end up, I would hope that it would never end up in a situation where only teachers, because that smacks of this IQ, or you have to have got this degree. That's precisely not where you want to land. You want to land in a place where anybody who's interested in the education system can pass the test and therefore have an equal weighted vote. And I think it's a very valid point, because there are these factions, and it goes back to the question earlier about the efficacy and the viability of democracies, where there's so many different interests that these politicians are pandering to. But that's how I'd get around that.
Unfortunately, we do not have time for all the questions that are out there. Yes, I know he's the best. Okay, but this gentleman has had his hand up for a while, so I was going to give it to him.
So you said that voting has fallen from 60% to 50%. In the last election with Trump, it was down. 91 million people didn't vote, which I think is just utterly pathetic. Did you do any research to see why people don't vote? And even if we did do the mandatory voting, aren't politicians just diabolical at their jobs, and it won't make that much of a difference anyway? It's just going to be that all the ships rise equally?
Great question. Yes, I did look at a lot of why people don't vote. It's a whole host of reasons. Some of them we've talked about already. Sometimes just disaffection. I think these guys are not, I don't care. They're just useless, greedy bastards. Then there's the view, actually, it's too expensive. I just can't I cannot sacrifice 5-6 hours standing there, especially for minimum wage workers. So there is a cost consequence as well. And it's a great question, because obviously the public policy response will have to really get at what the real reason is people aren't voting. But the other point that you're making, which just pops out of my head when you said it, it was about.
If you get everyone to vote.
Oh yes, yes. Okay, so that is a fantastic question, because I've been working on that recently, because I've gone to countries where there is mandatory voting, and the question is, how do outcomes, first of all, as well as public policy choices, change from a place where there's no mandatory voting to mandatory voting? Well, if we take the premise, which is correct, that poorer people don't vote, And generally, that also means certain racial groups, certain genders are not voting. A world where it's mandatory means that you do get potentially swings in the in who ends up being elected, but also what kind of public policy outcomes people want. So, in fact, there's some studies. This is something I'm working on right now, which is talking about some of these studies. They found that in Netherlands is a great example of this. The Netherlands used to have mandatory voting. They got rid of mandatory voting. When they looked at the comparison, first of all, the numbers went from like 91% down to like 40%, 50%, which is very common. But the biggest drop was young people. And actually, when you have young people, their desires and or even poorer people, a lot of that is about food, healthcare. It's not about sort of taxation, which is where if you have many more wealthy people who are interested in sort of intergeneral transfers, inheritance tax, property tax. So those, I think it does matter a lot what public policy and what politicians focus on. Right now, politicians really, if they're rational, it's immaterial, for them to pander to poor voters. Just the numbers don't really work for them. If they really want to make it, they need to focus on the rich voters. And that, to me, is completely against the principles of democracy, which are one man, one vote.
So we actually have to shut it off. I've sworn to Nicholas that I would let everybody go by 8 o'clock, and we're at 8:01. Before we go, just one plug for the prize. Please nominate somebody for the Berggruen Prize. If you don't log on and nominate somebody, you will not be invited back. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm only sort of kidding. One person, one nomination.
Otherwise, we'll have to
and
wait
don't
the nomination.
Nominate yourself or your brother. Or it doesn't work like that, unless he's a brilliant philosopher. What's that?
It's been extended.
Yes. Yes. So please log on and nominate. But thank you, Dr. Dambisa Moyo. This has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you.